Turn in your Bibles to Genesis 27. Tonight we're going to look at Bible costumes. You know, oftentimes people will dress up Halloween. Well, no, people weren't dressing up for Halloween in the Bible, but there were some occasions when people wore disguises. And one of the first that you'd find is found in Genesis 27. Now this, of course, had to do with Isaac and Esau and Jacob. Isaac had gotten older, his eyesight was bad, and so he tells his firstborn son Esau to go out and to kill some game, cook it for him, and then he's going to give him the blessing. But you see, Mama overhears, and Mama's favorite is Jacob, not Esau, and she'd like Jacob to get this blessing. So she tells Jacob, now you do what I tell you to do. You know, kiddos, you listen to your mamas. Always. But when you get to be old enough, always be looking at what God says first. And in this case, it's kind of sad because there's so much lie and deception that's going on now in the story. And so he says, well, he'll know because Esau's hairy and I'm smooth. And so she tells him, you go get the best clothing out of Esau's closet. She didn't say Esau's closet, but get his best clothing. You put his clothing on. And then you get some fur and you put it on the back of your hand and smooth part of your neck. And then you cook up a goat and you get it ready and then you take it to your father. Wearing Esau's clothes and having that fur on the back of your hand and the smooth part of your neck. So he does just as Mama says, and he goes then to Isaac. And Isaac's kind of curious at first. You know, you haven't had long enough to hunt down the game, to prepare it, to fix it and bring it to me. And he said, well, the Lord was with me. And when I read that in my Bible, and then I put right beside it, bold-faced lie. That's what's going on here. He says, I'm Esau, your firstborn. He's not, he's Jacob. And then he says he was able to get it because the Lord your God granted me success. Bold-faced lie. And then we even find he's kind of suspicious. His eyesight's bad, but apparently he's got good enough hearing. He says, well, the voice is Jacob's voice. But the hands, feeling the hands of Jacob with the fur, are Esau's hands. And then as you even go down further, he says, come near me and kiss me, my son. And as you read this, he came near and he kissed him. And Isaac smelled the smell of his garments. And you kind of even wonder if, this is one last test. I'm a little suspicious based on the voice. But here there's the fur and it smells like my son Esau. And so he was given the blessing. The sad part, children sometimes today dress up for fun. And it's just for fun. Most of these occasions of a disguise in the Bible, characters were up to no good. And in this case, of course, you've got Jacob doing what his mother said, but telling his father bold-faced lies, disguising himself to be like his brother and to steal that blessing. The next place we read of a disguise is found in Genesis 38. In Genesis 38, you have some principal characters of Judah. And then he had 3 sons. That first son was who then married a woman named Tamar. And then there were 2 other sons, Onan and Shelah. And as it turned out, was a very wicked man, and the Lord took his life. And then according to the levirate marriage custom, and I think that's what you might say at this point, but when you get into Deuteronomy 25, you find it was a part of Old Testament law. And the reason we say levirate is because that word Levir, levir, it's from the Latin. It means husband's brother. Well, it was the case then that having died, it was then to Onan that was to bear a child with Tamar to carry on the seed of the brother. Well, he disobeys in the matter, and the Lord takes his life. So then there's Shelah. Shelah's yet kind of young, so Judah says, no, not yet. But it kind of in the back of his mind is, I've already had 2 sons to die, and I'm kind of concerned about Shelah. Well, the time continues to rock on, and it became time where, well, it should have been Shelah now to carry on this duty. But, see, Judah doesn't comply. And then you have Tamar disguising herself. And she takes off her widow garments, and she covers herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, presents herself to be someone she's not, and then Judah sins. Now here's a disguise, but I'm going to tell you about this story. This story has wrong written all over it. You might even go back to Judah and say, you married this Canaanite woman. But certainly in the case of he was so wicked that God took his life. Onan refusing to obey, and God took his life. And then Tamar presenting herself to be someone she was not. And then Judah, he himself sinned in this matter. This is a story that's got wrong written all over it. But there in the middle of it, you find the disguise, the costume. Now we're going to Joshua chapter 9. Joshua chapter 9. Now if you think in terms of Joshua, well, of course this is the conquest. And the conquest, well, with Jericho went right well. At first with Ai, not so well. And then Ai was defeated. And then, you see, Israel continued to defeat its enemies. So much so that the enemies, they were afraid. And so in chapter 9, you read about the Gibeonite deception. Now it mentions the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, all of these that they were going to be defeated. They were certainly not to make covenants with them. But you see, the inhabitants of Gibeon, and we might say, well, Gibeon, I don't read of Gibeon there in verse 1. But Gibeon would have been the capital of the Hivites. So these were the Hivite people, the Gibeonites. So here's what the Gibeonites people did. In verse 4 it says they acted their part with cunning. And so they took provisions. By the way, it'd be kind of this way. Bring me the old crusty bread. Bring me the food that looks like it's about to mold. You see, they were going to present to the Israelites that they had come from a long distance, a great journey. They didn't want them to think they were their immediate neighbors. And then they even took out sacks and wineskins that were worn out and torn. They took patched sandals, of the old shoes, if you would, and wore those. And they took worn out clothes. See, they were doing their very best to present themselves as somebody they weren't. We've been on a long journey, as if we're not your neighbors. So here we see their costume. Their costumes is the old clothes, the old shoes, the worn out wine bags and the worn out sacks, and bread that's dry and crumbly. And so then they go to the Israelites. We've come from a distant country, and we want you to make a covenant with us. Now in verse 7 it says, but the men of Israel said to the Hivites, yes, they were Gibeonites, Gibeonite being the town, the Hivites being the people. Well, then you find that they even then said, we're from a distant country, and we've come here because of the name of the Lord your God. And then they begged, come now, make a covenant with us. Here's our bread. It was still warm when we took it from our houses as our food for the journey on the day we set out to come to you. And now, behold, it's dry and crumbly. These wineskins were new when we filled them. Behold, they have burst. And these garments and sandals of ours are worn out from the very long journey. So again, a costume, but they're up to no good. Now the sad thing here is that Israel did make that covenant with the Gibeonites. But God had said, don't make a covenant with these 7 nations of Canaan, the Hivites being one of those 7 nations. By the way, as we come towards an end, we're going to talk about the devil, Satan. And yes, he disguises himself. And just know this, sometimes those with ill intentions, those who would wrong you, those who would hurt you, those who would bring you into sin, they will lie to you. They sometimes will disguise themselves. And that's what we've seen happening in these 3 instances so far. Turn over now to 1 Samuel 28. 1 Samuel 28. 1 Samuel 28. This is about Saul. And in this particular instance, Saul was going to do battle with the Philistines. And, well, this is one of those occasions when Saul was afraid that the Philistines would outbest them and that they might be defeated. He's concerned, he's worried. And so he inquires of God about this matter. But God does not answer him at all. Not answer him, and specifically verse 6 says, either by dreams or by Urim or by the prophets. God doesn't answer him. And so he's thinking, I got to know. Well, Saul, one of the things he had done right is he had expelled the, depending on what translation, witches or mediums and the necromancers from the land. But he finds himself kind of wanting one now. And so he says to his servants, seek out for me a woman who is a medium. King James Version says witch, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a medium at Endor. Now, all my life heard witch at Endor. This is the passage. Like I say, the English Standard Version uses the word medium. But now in verse 8 it says, so Saul disguised himself, put on other garments, and went. He and 2 men went with him. So once again, he, as it were, he puts on a costume. He disguises himself. He doesn't dress like kingly Saul. But then he goes to her, and as the story says, divine for me a spirit, and bring up for me whomever I shall name to you. The woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done, how he has cut off the mediums and the necromancers from the land. Why then are you laying a trap for my life to bring about my death? But Saul swore to her by the Lord, as the Lord lives, no punishment shall come upon you for this thing. Then the woman said, whom shall I bring up for you? And he said, bring up Samuel for me. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. Now, at this juncture, usually the reader is kind of questioning, wait, did she really have the power to bring up someone from the dead? Well, it is the case that in this particular story that, yes, Samuel, who had been dead, is been brought back, as it were. I would suggest to you, though, that no, she didn't really have this power. When the woman saw Samuel, she cried out with a loud voice. I think she was as surprised as anybody there to see Samuel. And then she said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You are Saul. The king said to her, do not be afraid. What do you see? And the woman said, I see a God coming up from the earth. He said to her, what is his appearance? She said, an old man is coming. He is wrapped in a robe. And Saul knew that it was Samuel, and he bowed with his face to the ground and paid homage. And now, a very interesting thing is here. Samuel said to Saul, why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Think about that. Samuel was dead. He wasn't dead all over like Rover. No. But he did say, why have you disturbed me so by bringing me up? So this instance, once again, was an act of deception, but Saul, he put on a disguise. He wore a costume. Now go to 1 Kings 14. 1 Kings chapter 14. Now this has to do with Jeroboam and Jeroboam's wife. You find that Abijah was a son of Jeroboam, and he was sick. And so Jeroboam says to his wife, you arise, disguise yourself, that it not be known that you're the wife of Jeroboam. Go to Shiloh, and then go to Ahijah. And Ahijah was the one who had presented himself to Jeroboam to say, Jeroboam, you're going to be king. We're going to rip these tribes from David's lineage. And of course, this was that occasion of after Solomon, the third king of Israel. And Jeroboam would be given 10 of the 12 tribes. But you see, Jeroboam, he didn't do as he should have done. And, we read about Isaac. Isaac was old and his eyes were dim. That's the same thing that's said now of Ahijah. His eyesight's not so good as well. And no doubt Jeroboam and Jeroboam's wife's thinking, he won't know, we're disguised, he doesn't see well, he won't know. But you see, the Lord had said to Ahijah, this is verse 5, behold, the wife of Jeroboam is coming to inquire of you concerning her son, for he is sick. Now the end results of all of this is that son will die, and it's directly as a result of Jeroboam's disobedience. But once again, find another costume, if you would, disguise in the Bible. Now go over to 1 Kings chapter 22. 1 Kings chapter 22. In 1 Kings chapter 22, the story really begins more about verse 29. But you find that Ahab, the king of Israel, and by the way, Ahab was a very, very ungodly king, as all the kings of Israel were. But it joined forces with Jehoshaphat, who was the king of Judah. And when you read this whole context, you might think, Jehoshaphat, why are you doing this? Don't you know better? King Ahab's a very evil king. We find in verse 30, the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, I'll disguise myself and go into battle, but you wear your robes. Think about this. One king saying, I'm not going to look like a king. I'm going to look like an ordinary soldier. But you wear your robes as if you look like the king. You almost think, once again, Jehoshaphat, come on now, can't you see through this? But the king of Syria, who they were going to be battling, has said to his army, says, fight with neither the small nor the great, but only the king of Israel. You got that? He says, I don't care about you battling the regular soldier or the commander. I want the king of Israel. Well, the captains, they saw Jehoshaphat, and, he's still dressed like the king. They thought, surely this is the king of Israel. But they turned to fight against him, and Jehoshaphat cried out. And then the captains of the chariots, they saw that it was not the king of Israel. And so at this point, you might think, well, I guess King Ahab, he had a pretty good course of action. This says in verse 34, certain man drew his bow at random and struck the king of Israel between the scale armor and the breastplate. As you read this, it almost sounds like he didn't even know who he was shooting at. But nevertheless, well, he's not dead yet. Verse 35, the king was propped up in his chariot facing the Syrians until that evening when he died. And so even King Ahab, he tried to dress up. He put on that costume, but it didn't help him. In the Bible, these stories of people wearing costumes really didn't turn out so well. And it was always with sinister deception. Kind of sad. As you turn to the New Testament, you also find some instances of, if you would, costumes. Not quite of the same variety that we've read about in the Old Testament. But for instance, in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, beware of the prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravening wolves. These false prophets, ravening wolves, but they're presenting themselves as sheep. They're putting on a costume. They're making themselves to be something they're not. They're seeking to be deceptive, to get an upper hand, to draw away the true disciple. Wolves in sheep's clothing. And then another place, 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 13, it says, for such are false apostles. So this is the people he's speaking of, the false apostles. And then he describes them as deceitful workmen. Now listen, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. So in Paul's day, there were some men presenting themselves to be apostles of Christ, but in reality they were not apostles of Christ. And in fact, as he describes here, they were false apostles. Nevertheless, they had kind of, if you would, disguised themselves. Then two verses later, if someone were to say, well, of all these passages in the Old Testament and New Testament, which would be most relevant? Which matters the most? Which should I pay the most attention to? I'd suggest 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 14. See, there it says, and no wonder, for even Satan, disguises himself as an angel of light. Again, and no wonder, for even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. You know, it's just this way. Satan doesn't want you to think he's Satan. He's lost a distinct advantage if you know he's Satan. He may appear to be your friend. He doesn't appear so sinister. He's not someone that you're afraid of, on guard against. In fact, he's someone that you let into your life. Maybe even you let into your heart. But ultimately, his motives are wrong. His motives are against you. And his motives are hurtful. And ultimately, that you would sin, that you would disobey God, that you would abandon the Christian life. That's what he wants. And that's what he's trying to do. You know, I don't think that you're going to have your mother tell you to go get your brother's clothes and put them on, and put some fur on the back of your hand and your smooth part of your neck, and then you pretend you be your brother when you go to your dad. I don't think that's going to happen. You know, I don't think that any of you are going to be an Ahab who tries to make himself look less kingly to protect himself in battle. I do think, however, that this warning in 2 Corinthians 11:14 applies just as much today as it did when Paul wrote those words. Even Satan disguises himself as an angel of light. And we need to beware. We need to be careful. We need to be distinguishing truth and right, and who is teaching truth and right. And then we need to be living according to God's truth, living the right way. Those are some Bible examples of disguises where people tried to dress up to be, or to appear to be, to deceive people to think they were somebody they were not. And like I said, you know, I don't think that applies to what children do. In fact, I don't think that it's the case that we don't realize who these children are. It's just kind of a little make-believe they enjoy for a little period of time. Are you one of God's people? Or are you living the faithful Christian life? If we could assist you in your obedience tonight, if there is a need for baptism, or if there's a need for prayer, we'd be glad to help you. Just please come as we stand.